In this session, we will hear from 3 UBC faculty who recently attended COP and a UBC student who supported those efforts, and about how we might gesture beyond the binary of Doomism versus Solutionism. Before we dive into the conversation, I will introduce our panelists. Dr. Pasang Yangjee Sherpa is a Sharwa anthropologist from Nepal. She's jointly appointed in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and the Department of Asian Studies as an assistant professor of lifeways in Indigenous Asia. Her research, writing, and pedagogy focus on climate change and indigeneity amongst Himalayan communities, guided by the question, how do we live in the midst of dying? She's currently involved in 2 collaborative projects. The first, titled Transnational Sherpas, investigates what it means to be a Sherpa today. The second seeks just pathways for sustainable futures in the Anthropocene and includes critical reflections on how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, can open up space for Indigenous peoples and local communities. Dr. Shannon Waters is Coast Salish and a member of the Doomism First Nation on Vancouver Island. Dr. Waters worked as the Director of Health Surveillance at First Nations and Inuit Health Branch and at First Nations Health Authority as the Acting Senior Medical Officer for Vancouver Island Region. She has worked with Vancouver Island Health Authority as a medical director and with the Ministry of Health as the Aboriginal Physician Advisor. She's currently honored to be working in her home territory as the local medical officer with Island Health. Dr. Vanessa Andreotti is interim director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities, and Global Change and the David Lamb Chair in Multicultural Education. She's a professor in the Department of Educational Studies and incoming Dean of Education at the University of Victoria. Dr. Andreotti's research examines historical and systemic patterns of reproduction of inequalities and how these limit or enable possibilities for collective existence and global change. Her research analyzes political economies of knowledge production, discussions of the ethics of international development, and critical comparison of ideals of globalism and internationalization in education and global activism, with an emphasis on representations of and relationships with marginalized communities. Charlotte Taylor is an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia. She's currently studying in her 3rd year as a BA student in interdisciplinary studies with a focus on climate change in media. Charlotte currently works as an undergraduate program assistant to amplify Indigenous and critically engaged voices at COP27 through the UBC Climate Hub and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. She also works as student engagement lead for the UBC Climate Hub, contributes articles to Starfish Canada's Youth Journal, and serves as an editorial board member for the UBC Journal for Climate Justice. In her artistic and advocacy efforts toward climate justice, Charlotte continues to explore relational and decolonial avenues for systems change. So let's get started with the conversation. My first question for you all is about COP27. So at COP, you and those who you worked with to support sought to bring awareness to false solutions that are being proposed in response to the climate and nature emergency that promise hope, certainty, and continuity, and which more often than not reproduce forms of green capitalism and green colonialism that treat Indigenous lands as sites of profit and ignore the rights, experiences, and expertise of Indigenous nations and communities in the Global South. I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit on the efforts to draw attention to false solutions at COP. How was this critique received, and what might be the next steps for inviting more critical engagement?
I'll start, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and just setting the stage for this conversation, Dr. Sharon. So I attended COP27. I was there for the 2nd week, and I was there from Tuesday until Thursday, so not too many days. But the time I was there, I saw that this discussion and about false solutions were mostly happening where Indigenous peoples were present or being led by these kinds of conversations were led by Indigenous peoples, leaders, scholars, activists, and supporters of Indigenous peoples. So that being said, it was loud. It was loud, it was present, but it was also not everywhere. And the COP27 was dominated, as expected, by bigger corporations with fancier and bigger pavilions, and also bigger nation states with a lot of funds and resources to mobilize people, to bring people, and to bring things, materials to Sharm el-Sheikh to indicate some kind of significance. Whereas Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, and supporters were talking about these issues, we're talking about and raising awareness about false solutions. And there were people from everywhere, all around the world, not just global North Indigenous peoples, but peoples from the front lines of climate change in global South, who we usually don't see when we read newspapers or read coverage about COP27. So that's my impression.
I think I can go next. I actually have a video that I took of snippets of walking through the place that I would like to share just to illustrate some of what Dr. Sherpa was talking about. So I'll try, I have it in another login.
Climate justice! Save the planet! Save the planet! Save the planet! Save the planet! Save the ocean! Save the ocean! Save the ocean! Save the ocean!
You will see at the beginning of the video the entrance to the event, where every day you could see some organizations protesting. Then you had to go through security and you ended up in a more open space with different buildings or areas. And inside each area there were pavilions, which are spaces rented by government, civil society organizations, and other institutions where they coordinate their own events. So here you can see the UN Pavilion, for example. I spend most of my time in the Indigenous Pavilion, which we'll show in the video in a minute. So walking through these areas, you would have a sense of why some critics describe COP27 as a trade show. I prefer to describe it as a war of narratives, where those Indigenous peoples who are critical of COP27 or the COP process in general have a role and a place in the cracks, so to speak. But the critical voices that come from the cracks, they don't necessarily land in other places. I went to COP as an observer from UBC, from the UBC delegation, but my main role was to support an Indigenous delegation from the Brazilian Amazon, the delegation of the Hunikui people, who saw themselves as representing the voice of the Amazon forest at COP27. My role was to support the cultural translation of the messages of the forest to different audiences at COP27. The delegation from the Amazon was also part of a wider Indigenous delegation called the Indigenous Environmental Network. This network has a long history in advocating against false solutions to the climate crisis and for Indigenous rights and land back. At COP27, this network released reports that present Indigenous critiques of climate finance, nature-based solutions, and climate-smart agriculture. They also have a publication called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which offers the basics around false solutions and colonialism in climate mitigation. We will put the links to these reports and the publication on the chat. So I supported the Amazonian Indigenous delegation with the translation of their messages, with relations with the media, and with OpEDs. I was also asked to support Indigenous youth to participate in the forums of the UN for Indigenous young people. In my role as cultural translator and climate educator, it was very interesting to observe how critical Indigenous voices operate in the wider narrative war and what is necessary to expand capacity for the message of the forest to be intelligible to different audiences. As you can see in the video, another thing that was really interesting and also heartbreaking was to observe how diversity was showing up in this COP. When I went to COP23 in Bonn, in Germany in 2017, what I could see was mostly that the majority of participants were white men in suits, with some women and very few people of color, some of whom were being paraded as exotic tokens in the discussions. But because COP27 was in Egypt, in Africa, you could see much more diversity in this context. But the heartbreaking part was that.
And I'll say this with trepidation because this is a difficult conversation to be had that can be weaponized. I saw many of the diverse bodies saying the same things that the white people, the white men in suits were saying before. So this idea of multicultural capitalism being very present at that COP was one of the things that made it very difficult for me, who was expecting more diverse and critically engaged voices to be present, and who was trying to support Indigenous voices, both through the support to the Hunikui delegation, but also the partnership with the Peter Wall Institute and the Climate Hub in trying to amplify these voices. In the beginning specifically, until I managed to digest the fact that I had idealized it and then be able to sit with the reality of it, it was very difficult for me. So I think I'll stop there.
Oh, yeah, hi everyone, and good to see you, Pasang and Vanessa and Charlotte and Sharon. This was my first COP that I had gone to, and I was there on the second week. Like Pasang, I think it was overwhelming. And I would say as the end of the week was coming to a close, there felt to be like more and more pressure. Like there was more, thanks for the video, Vanessa, because it was, there was a lot of sights and sounds, and you always felt like you weren't at the right place. Like the whole process in and of itself is incredibly extractive. And towards the end, you find yourself feeling a bit more and more exhausted. I found myself saying to someone who I connected with, who was with the Global Climate Health Alliance, like it was almost like being in a long distance relationship. I don't know if people have been in a long distance relationship, but you have this short period of time together and you have to make everything happen within that short period of time because then you're going to be apart. And if one thing goes wrong, then it kind of mars the whole thing. And like, she kind of laughed. She's like, yeah, because she's been to a number of COPs. And she said, I could see how it feels that way. But like really the grounding parts for me were being able to walk around with Pasang and Vanessa to go to the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. And one thing just on this particular question that sticks out in my mind is talking with Vanessa and Chief Niniwa, who was in some of the video there at one point. And I was feeling like, geez, like this is such a false process. And like then it was mentioned that this was the 12th COP meeting that Chief Niniwa had been to. And I was like, it just kind of struck me, oh, it's not like trying to like cram, a relationship into a number of days. Like for us as Indigenous people, this is a way of life. And so like going to 12 COPs or more is actually, I'm sure quite difficult, but like that it's falsified in how quick it even is and what a relationship is. And so I think, just hearing again when I was at, sorry, my light just went out. When I was at, conversations with Indigenous peoples where that relationality came up, that just brought me back to center and really about why I was there in the first place. So yeah, I mean, even though it was extractive, I still found it fueling and fulfilling in how we are, have so many similarities as Indigenous peoples as to how we're approaching this.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Sherpa and Dr. Andreotti and Dr. Waters for sharing. I didn't attend COP27 in person, so I was only hearing messaging back from the delegations who were there attending programming. But I did just want to speak a little bit to some of the themes that have already been touched on by the other speakers. So in particular, I did work with Camilla, who's one of our lovely team members from the Peter Wall Institute, on communicating and amplifying videos which were filmed and created by an Indigenous youth communicator from the Brazilian delegation team, actually at COP27, live and in person. And so we have this long playlist of videos where you can hear more directly from Indigenous and critically engaged advocates. And I'll put a link in the chat now to one video with Chief Ninawa Hunikui, who Dr. Waters just mentioned, speaking directly about some of those same themes of nature as being part of life and not having any degree of separability when we talk about the complicity that's inherent in these systems of violence. Nature and life and human life are all deeply interconnected. And some of the other speakers also already have touched on ideas of sort of debunking solutionism, which is perpetuated so deeply at COP27 and other international climate solutions. But I did just want to really highlight and emphasize the importance of holding the complexity and the ambiguities that accompany our current climate and nature emergency, and understanding the really vital role of self-determination in land and food and water sovereignty, and advancing real solutions, which are really based on this holistic relational understanding of how we might begin to slowly address climate catastrophe. I'll also add in the chat, just for folks who are joining a little bit later, here's a short overview of part of the focus of this panel, so that you can have some more information about some of the ideas that were touched on in the article on which the title of this panel is named. And I'll also include a longer description of the project and the work that I was involved with in collaboration with the UBC Climate Hub and the Peter Wall Institute, as Dr. Andreotti already mentioned. So we have a few different components, which I'll hopefully be able to speak to a bit more later in this panel, but we do have some different communications items. So we have in particular this series of videos, which I touched on in collaboration with the Brazilian delegation at COP27, speaking directly with advocates who were there as members of civil society, representatives of different social organizations, local government members, etc. We also have a settler responsibility forest walk resource, and then a longer, more comprehensive resource guide will be shared later this month. So I'll have more updates on that in the chat as well, if anyone would like to read more. And yeah, thank you again, Dr. Stein, for that really wonderful introduction to everyone and what's bringing us here together today. And I'll pass things back to you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, so much for sharing a bit about your experience. I wonder if we can keep going with that, not just thinking about COP, I guess, but also thinking about documents like the IPCC report and even educational institutions like UBC, and kind of addressing this question of, I mean, you already heard a bit about this, about COP, but to what extent do these spaces actually create more space for genuine engagement with critically informed, complex perspectives on the climate and nature emergency? And perhaps how might they, or how might we push for them to make more space for this kind of engagement? Whoever wants to start.
I can go, since it might be easier to just follow So I think to answer this question, I really think about, first of all, where and how Indigenous peoples are even included or allowed to enter, or when they are present, how their knowledge is used or gets exploited. I think those things need to be named and identified so we can address the issue here. So some of the ways that I see, especially because I am focusing a lot these days analyzing the latest IPCC assessment report, which I was also one of the contributing authors to. And so based on my personal experience and what others have been saying, critically reflecting on publishing, is that there are a couple of things that have happened. First of all, Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous peoples are invited, or space has been created, but in order to support the dominant Western scientific framing or the dominant climate change narrative, and not necessarily to create space for those kinds of different or plural knowledge systems to exist on its own, and make the contributions that they and recognize the contributions that they're already making. So that's not happening, and I think that's something we should just bring it to the front if we are serious about dealing with it. The other thing is also, I think so compared to previous IPCC assessment reports, the latest one is considered to be the most inclusive, most progressive, most, the best among the rest. And but even when these kinds of comments are made, we need to recognize what that progress means is that just a little bit of change. And in this case, maybe some more Indigenous peoples are included, and maybe just a few mentions of the word Indigenous or similarly relevant words are utilized or mentioned and included. But really not making the kind of change that is necessary to address the problem, which is the dominance of a singular knowledge system, singular narrative, and singular explanation of the singular presence, and painting a picture of a singular future. And I think that is a big problem. And so with this being said, to come back to your question and what needs to be done and what can be done, I really think in this case, and when it comes to climate and nature emergency, Indigenous peoples have been leading Indigenous scholars and activists who know the issue, who have been organizing, who have been studying, who have been publishing, reading, writing. They've been around as long as the UN systems have been around. And they've been around as, even longer than the UN systems have been around and talking about these issues. As there have been several Indigenous declarations, several ways Indigenous peoples have pointed to the just pathways, ethical pathways for responsible, sustainable futures. But the real question is, have we listened to them? And we haven't. And I really think if we are serious about the super wickedness of the climate and nature emergency today, we really have to pay attention to the people who know what they're talking about and who have been doing this for a long time. And it happens to be Indigenous leaders and scholars for the past several decades. And unless we as teachers in university like the UBC, or if we as researchers, scholars, or if we as authors to contributing to authors to IPCC reports, we don't recognize that there are plural knowledge systems that have proven record and that have a lot to teach us. If we don't pay attention to them and to that, I think, I don't know how we're going to move forward, frankly.
I will just complement a little bit and support what Dr. Sherpa is talking about. I was the translator for Tiffany Nawahoniki in the US panel and other a US pavilion panel around Indigenous engagement in Indigenous science that actually Dr. Sherpa helped organize, and in another adjacent event also on knowledge justice, a platform that was, or a network that was formed and that was launched there. So Chief Ninawa made 3 points in relationship to that question. Number one was that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science is a different kind of science, but it cannot be invited in just in support of Western science or as a complement to Western science. Its integrity needs to be recognized. And he talked about a technology that goes with Indigenous science. And he made a distinction between the technologies of domination, mastery, and engineering that Western societies have, as opposed to the technology of, it was 4 things: relationship, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility towards the wider metabolism of the planet that Indigenous people have had for a long time. So it's 2 types of technology. He was hopeful that it can be, one technology can be brought alongside the other, and there will be tensions. And the third thing that he said is that for that to happen, Western science needs to shed its arrogance. And it's impossible to do this walking together, this accompany each other, or this integration, if that doesn't happen. And that reminded me of another project I was involved with in the arts sector with Indigenous curator Elwood Jimmy, where we saw the same thing in the arts, people, organizations wanting to decolonize and to indigenize. And when they hired Indigenous people to do that, many times there was a mismatch between the understandings of decolonization and indigenization of organizations and the understandings of indigenization and decolonization of Indigenous people, causing a lot of frustration in these forms of engagement that haven't done the difficult work of unlearning that needs to happen before we can actually get to zero and start to walk together. So the name of the report of this project is Towards Braiding. It's widely used in the arts sector, but I was wondering what it would look like in relationship to the IPCC, if we could it's not a checklist. Basically, people want checklists. Like, how do we do this, right? This is a counter checklist proposition for us to do the difficult work of expanding our capacity to sit with the difficult and painful things that come with our complicity and implication in wider historical and structural harm, and commit to the long-term process, to developing stamina for the long-term process of holding the weight of all these complexities and getting through the storm together, so that we can practice or start to rehearse the epistemologies of coordination that Kyle White talks about, that will be needed to address these wicked challenges, super wicked challenges, in a good way.
I think of a session I think Pasang already mentioned, where we were at one of the pavilions where it was talked about the latest IPCC report and how this report had done better and that there was more Indigenous input. But there was not an Indigenous author on that panel, because there wasn't anyone who was Indigenous who was eligible within the Western academic educational attainment to be deemed a lead author. And we asked some questions within that panel that basically led us to realize that the dominant paradigm was restrictive, didn't allow access, didn't value as, this Indigenous knowledge in the same way, so that an Indigenous person could be a lead author, even talking about this IPCC report in the first place. And so I think that really just highlighted again and again something that I think about a lot, which is governance. How are our decisions made, and what are the value systems that underpin how we make decisions? And like COP is not, it has Indigenous peoples there, but the dominant paradigm of decision making is a completely Western perspective like the IPCC reports that come in to inform those conversations. And so it really just led me to believe, like, I mean, the work we need to keep doing is how do we change the governance systems so that Indigenous knowledge is critical to the decision making, because otherwise information will be brought forward, not valued in the same way, and decisions will be continuing to be made based on the value systems of extractivism and other things that they've continued to be made on.
Yes, thank you. Oh, yes, please,
yeah,
Dr. Sherpa.
No, please go ahead, Charlotte. I can speak after you.
Oh, no, please. I would like you to add in so we're building on a point and not jumping around too much. Please go ahead.
Okay, just to just very quickly, and also like when people talk about including Indigenous knowledge, it's almost as if Indigenous knowledge is something that can be extracted and then fit into this Western paradigm, Western epistemology, and then whatever comes out, that like I think there's this satisfaction with that model of using and presenting Indigenous knowledge, and that's not what we're talking about here. And so it's actually recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is separate. And I just wanted to like just share that with everyone before I forget to mention that.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sherpa, and thank you for sharing. I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to amplify on that point. And actually, it was incredibly useful as well because it gave me time to find a link that I was looking for, which is to this site for a book that actually Dr. Stein recommended and kindly lent to me called Fresh Banana Leaves. If no one's already read it, it's a really, really excellent resource on Indigenous science and how as this has already been highlighted by a few other panelists, the weighting of Indigenous science, particularly within institutions and other structures that tend to uphold Western science above Indigenous science, or at the very least, we'll see Indigenous science as an add-on, something to support foregone conclusions that are formed within Western science modes of thinking. And this resource, I think, is a really excellent insight into how we need to recenter Indigenous understandings. So I'm glad that I got a chance to get that link organized together. And then I'll also share, just in the context of COP15 right now, as I'm sure lots of folks here are already thinking about those negotiations and following along progress. There's this really excellent article by Grist talking about the 30 by 30 set goals and particularly Indigenous negotiations and resistance towards specific goals of the 30% kind of markers, which I think is a really important context as well for this discussion. But I would sort of just with those pieces of framing in place, I would really like to just again emphasize some of the points already touched on by Dr. Stein about narrative wars at COP and by Dr. Sherpa about the danger of single story narratives in particular, and how having these singular ideas of how we might come to fix such a broad and complex issue as climate catastrophe will inevitably prevent us from making meaningful action on climate. And I also just wanted to touch on Dr. Andreotti's point about stamina and holding the weight of complexities. This is something that in thinking about this question, I did want to make sure that I highlighted as a student of the Facing Human Wrongs course, which is currently being run at UBC, part of the broader Climate and Nature Emergency Catalyst Fellowship. We've had lots of discussions about capacity building in particular, and how we can look at capacity building both on an individual level and looking at how we can expand our capacity to hold space for complexities and ambiguities, and also observe our patterns of resistance to accepting complicity in violence, but also on a broader systemic level, how we can look at the importance of capacity building in cultivating community resilience. So by advocating for different initiatives which are really rooted in self-determination. I also wanted to touch on dimensions of justice and well-being and care in accounting for these different and uneven exposures that we as individuals have to systemic violence through modernity/coloniality. This is something which is not a unified experience, and those disparate individual lived experiences need to really be brought into consideration when we're having these discussions as well. This is something we've thought a lot about within our fellowship cohorts as well, just in thinking about how we bring together interdisciplinary learning collectives, which again, I think is a really key component of starting to build towards more critical engagement programming within, as Dr. Stein said, this mode of very deeply entrenched, complex, systemic inclusion of difficult paradigms within like a university setting and an institutional setting as well. I do just want to emphasize the importance of bringing together interdisciplinary learning in not siphoning off different areas of study and learning, but actually bringing together in order to create more of a solid basis for decolonizing our ways of understanding the current climate and nature emergency. We also do talk in our fellowship cohort quite a bit about knowledge exchange, both as an important pedagogy and educational model, but also just in being mindful of the costs of the process of knowledge exchange and how this can quite easily become extractive. I think a lot of the points that the other panelists have touched on in relation to COP podiums and panel events, there is an inevitability of a certain amount of harm being perpetuated in these discussions of knowledge exchange. So really trying to ensure that we understand these as inseparable notions, the idea that knowledge exchange is necessary in some forms in order to develop a more comprehensive understanding, not just intellectually, but also really holding in our bodies and understanding the calibration of feeling and sitting with complexity. And I did also want to emphasize the importance of connecting our motivations for decolonial advocacy. I think Dr. Andreotti also touched on this idea of organizations wanting to decolonize or trying to make efforts in this direction of starting to move more away from structures of modernity and coloniality, but also understanding, Dr. Andreotti has a really wonderful saying, I suppose, or phrase about organizing in order to fill the heart more so than to fix solutions, because we also need to think about relationship building and reciprocity and broader relationalities when we're thinking about how we structure our organizing, because by maintaining these ideas of fixed goals for specific reaching a point of justice as a fixed location will inevitably lead to disappointment, because we can't structure one specific idea as being our entire goal in the advocacy work that we do. And to wrap up just my piece here, I also would like to add a few links in the chat to some of Dr. Sherpa's work and some of the collaborative articles that have come out of this COP27 experience with these delegates as well. So with that, I'll transition things back to you, Dr. Stein.
Thank you all so much. This is such a rich conversation. I feel very honored to be here and listening to you all. I think this will probably be the last question because we're getting toward the end, but I'm going to try and bring some of the threads that have been brought up together and direct us toward the question of education, which has also come up in various ways. So if we think of different responses to the climate and nature emergency as Dr. Andreotti said, a narrative war, then we can observe that it's not just critical people who are pushing for us to think deeper about this, but also places like the UN, which are using more and more kind of extreme language. So we had this summer the UN Secretary General warning that when it comes to climate change, humanity must choose between collective suicide or collective action. And then leading up to this current COP15 meeting that's happening right now in Montreal, the UN Environment Chief warned that we're facing a biodiversity apocalypse. So yes, these are very serious problems. At the same time, this kind of extreme language can amplify people's anxieties in ways that make them want to find that solution ever more resolutely and find that quick fix. And usually that's a quick fix that can be found within the existing system because they can't think beyond what's imaginable, right? But as many people on the panel have mentioned, Indigenous thinkers emphasize that a primary driver of the climate and nature emergency is the existing system itself and the solutions that are found within it. And particularly this notion of how that system invites us into this fantasy that we are separate from each other and from the earth, and incentivizes us to deny our responsibilities to each other and to the earth. And this is found in the work of Potawatomi scholar Kyle White that was already mentioned, as well as Chief Ninawahuni Kui. And I'll actually quote him to bring him into this space as well again to set up the next question. And he says that, quote, "What got us into this mess we are in are delusions of separation that have damaged our relationships with our own selves, with each other, with other species, and with the land. A genuinely different future depends much less on the images we create in our heads than on our ability to repair and to weave different relations in the present. The modern colonial imagination cannot solve the problems that the limited modern colonial imagination has created." End quote. So my question for you all is, how might a critically engaged climate education invite people to relate to the world differently, beyond the limits of what's deemed possible and desirable within the modern colonial imagination? Big question, sorry.
I think I've been working with this question for some time, so I will start. The course that Charlotte mentioned, Facing Human Wrongs, I think offers a context for us to think about this. So this was the course, we got TLEF interdisciplinary funding to create a course with land and food systems. So it was education in land and food systems. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic. And when we approached USI, the former USI, which is UBC Sustainability Initiative, where actually this collaboration emerged from, and we had to describe our project. So it was me and Will Valley, who were both fellows at USI. We said that we needed a course that would counter the tendency that we saw at UBC of courses about the climate, about climate education, being about countering students' despair or climate grief with solutions. So we wanted a course that didn't infantilize the students, that prepared them to face the storms that are coming with the stamina and resilience to not feel demotivated when they face the complexities of the issue. So we said, the word that we used, was that we needed a course that didn't coddle the students or treated them as customers or consumers of knowledge. And what the response was from the people who provided feedback was like, look, this is a pandemic. We already have an increase in anxiety, depression, and even self-harm amongst our students. Are you sure you want to open up all these cans of worms and leave the students to deal with that? And we said, well, look, we do want to open up cans of worms and hide the leads, but we also want to give students tools to be able to put these worms on the land. and create the capacity, expand their capacity and dispositions to face complexity. So we wanted to create a curriculum that was critically informed, but also complexity based. It was a complexity approach to climate education. And our response to the question of anxiety, depression, and self-harm was that, for sure, for some students, doing a course like this could lead them to spin in ways that we couldn't provide pastoral care for. But we also had to recognize that for other students, it's precisely the fact that we're not talking about the complexities and the realness of this issue. We're just saying it's going to be okay because we just do these things. We already know the answers. It's just about implementation. And they know that this is much more complex than that. This is what is causing the anxiety, depression, and self-harm for some people. So we needed a course that could be for the right people. Like we needed a way for students to choose if this course was for them or not. And we created strategies where we would be very upfront about what the course was about. We would be very upfront on the fact that we are not trying to tell them what to think or what to do, but to prepare them to arrive and encounter these wicked challenges from a very different space, in a space where they can actually take several steps back to be able to contemplate their complicity in harm, the unsustainability of the whole situation, the denial of our entanglement with each other, and the fact that the earth is biointelligent and alive. It's an entity, not a property, not a resource, and that we needed them to have the muscles to hold the multiple layers of complexity, and the vision to see that the depth of the problem, not to see the end of it, but to contemplate the depth of the problem, recognizing that many times what we're trying to do is to find quick fixes that make us look and feel good. So we wanted to redirect them from there towards a place where they could stay with the trouble, stay in the cracks, face their shadows, be invited to compost our collective shit and their individual shit, and develop the stamina and the stomach to sit with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up of humanity without throwing a tantrum or running away. So the course was then created and curated in a way that it's not prescriptive, it's diagnostic, it's the students' responses to things that are the content of the course. And it has become a very successful course in the sense that even in our first run, 60 students registered. After doing the test unit, 50% of the students decided not to take the course, but the 50% who stayed, it was definitely something very, very important for them. So much so that some of the students brought their families to do the course with them and asked us to take the course from Canvas, which is the platform of UBC, to register, to license the course through Creative Commons and to leave the course outside of the paywalls of the university. And that's what we did. And now more people can go through the course, both as self-study and as groups through that mechanism. So we were testing, I think, and experimenting in this context about the appetite for students to both sit with the complexity and complicity. And we found out that there are people ready to do that, and that in the same way that this course that invites into complexity and complicity can be problematic for some students, not having courses like this can also be very problematic and harmful for other students. The discernment about whether or not this course is for me is important, and I do have questions about whether the consent for the course, like how we can make it clearer and clearer what the course is about, so that people don't get surprised when the lids of the cans of worms are hidden and we are not allowing them to put the lids back on. But I think I have seen this now, 400 people go through this, and I know that what comes back to us is that it's not only a different way of, so people say, I'm not only seeing different things, I am seeing differently. And in terms of stamina, what we see people saying is that while I see other people around me panic, I now have a different space to hold the complexity and complicity without feeling immobilized, feeling overwhelmed, or demanding quick fixes or a rescue from the discomfort. So for us, this was very important in terms of what to imagine. What is it that both centering Indigenous knowledges and the problem itself. So I don't think the course centers particularly Indigenous, it is based on Indigenous approaches, but what is centered is the land itself. What happens if we can actually make space and connect with the planet and the trauma that humanity has caused to the planet, and then work from there? Because if you can't even see the problem, how are we going to provide any solution that is meaningful? So from that point of learning to sit with the pain of the land and allowing the body to be part of that land, and that land to dream through you, both the nightmares that we have created, but also some of the ways forward. I think it doesn't look like what we wanted, what we can imagine from within the colonial mode of being or the colonial institutions. It is something that is unimaginable, but it feels like probably more resilience in the long haul, I think. I think the response to your question would be, we need what that looks and feels and tastes and what it's like. It's something we can't, what being otherwise feels like, is something we can't imagine from the colonial spaces we have been conditioned by, like our desires, our thinking, our imagination are already constrained. So breaching those things is painful. And what it feels like on the other side is much more, it's much more to do with being able to be present and with, like, it's a with itness to the realness of it. It's not living in an idealization in this, or the hope in the continuity of the colonial capitalist system. I think I'll stop there.
Would anyone like to add to that?
Everything Vanessa said. So if I so I don't have anything to add. The only thing I would say is from my and as on the other side of the spectrum, as somebody who's just starting out in UBC and beginning to really grapple with these questions and critically engaged climate education, and how as a teacher what can I offer to my students? I think these are the questions that I'm also thinking about. And this question that I kind of have embraced, which is, how do we live in the midst of dying? That really comes out of my desire to make students realize the reality of things and to sit with the discomfort, but also not be paralyzed by it, but focus on the living part of it, but not as living as opposed to the denial, as opposed to death or denial of dying, but living and dying as a process that where it's cyclical process where one leads to another, and death is not always dark, and it's a beginning of something bright and new. And so just kind of expanding our ways of thinking about those concepts, and just living with the discomfort and paying attention to the things that matter. For example, building communities of care, building stamina. So those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. And as somebody who's developing or in the stage of developing courses right now, so that's what those are the kinds of things I'm thinking. And facing human wrongs is something I constantly look at, and then look for inspiration, look for strategies. So.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, like, quickly that like, there's so much uncertainty in this. Like, we don't know. It's a mystery. It's a sacred mystery. Like, what will come of this, which is not always easy from colonial systems that want black and white. But like within that, if we're really looking at this as a relationship, like, there's always time to heal a relationship. Like, we're not in a great situation, but there's always time to heal. There's always time for me and my home territory, for us to heal our relationship with the land, the water, the plants, and the animals that are here, even though we don't know, how long that relationship may be. So I think in so much of this trying to be sped up to, like, the shortness of this period of time that COP was, like, the urgency that can be created by some of these statements, like in creating that panic, there is a moment to step back and be like, if this is about healing, there's always time to heal.
Thank you so much, everyone. I won't add on too much more, just because I think so many of the points I would have spoken to have already been very eloquently explored, which is really excellent. But I'll just add on, maybe I feel that this might be helpful framing as well for folks who are part of this conversation who may be less familiar with the Facing Human Wrongs structure. But we did talk quite a bit about some of the distinctions between depth versus mastery education. And I think that's some really important framing to have in terms of exploring different pedagogies. So just understanding how depth education speaks to a more meaningful approach to understanding, again, moving beyond just intellectualizing, but further really sitting with and comprehending in a broader sense some of the complexities of the content and the learning that we're dealing with. And also understanding within a depth education model that the mastery education that we look at really does inherently perpetuate and reinforce dominant paradigms of green capitalism and techno-solutionism, and reinforces this dichotomy of failure versus success, which really doesn't have a place when we're talking about meaningful climate action. And this is also something that I have been reflecting on quite a bit lately, is just the notion of understanding that the only way in which we can truly fail on taking action towards climate justice is if we completely disinvest from sitting with these complexities. So as long as we are remaining engaged and taking part in these discussions, that will be what inevitably allows us to begin to move forward in these spaces and gesture towards different possible futures. There's really no way that we can be engaged in any of these issues if we disinvest. And also keeping front of mind the notion of failing forward, that in certain spaces and in certain learning, failing in the sense that we traditionally understand it is inevitable. So understanding what that failure teaches us and how we're implicated in different forms of failure, how the systems that we're a part of fail us as well. And just knowing that that's a really important component of moving forward in different imaginaries of what our future could consist of. And yes, thank you so much. I'm noticing that we're nearing the end of our time, so I'll pass things back over to Dr. Stein. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much again for another round of really generative conversation. And Charlotte, I hope that the people at UBC are listening to the student voice here. and saying that we don't want to be coddled. We actually want to sit with these difficulties, and we want your support in that. Of course, that will require us as faculty to do that work ourselves, which not all of us are super excited to do. So I'm gonna, is it okay to ask if there's any questions in the audience? I know that we're a bit over time, and if people have to go, that's also totally understandable. But I did want to leave space for that. If people want to raise their hands or put a question in the chat, now could be the time for that.
Yes, thank you so much for highlighting that, Dr. Stein. I also should have made a note to type that in the chat earlier in case folks had anything come up as some of the panelists were speaking and wanted to write it down then. But if anyone does have anything now, please do feel free to unmute yourself or add in the chat as well.